Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're talking about 13 days. 13 days in 1962, when the entire world held its breath, staring right into the abyss of nuclear war. You read something like this, and it sounds like teenage drama. But no, in October of 1962, this was real. This was the bone-deep fear that millions of people, kids and adults alike, felt every single day, as the two biggest superpowers on Earth had their fingers on the button. So, how on earth did we get there? How did humanity come literally a hair's breadth away from destroying itself? Well, to figure that out, our story starts on a small, revolutionary island in the Caribbean. You see, this whole thing didn't start with some big, loud explosion. It started with a secret. A huge, incredibly risky Soviet plan called Operation Anadyr. And it was all driven by two massive problems that Moscow was facing. Okay. So let's try and get inside the mind of this Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev. He's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, he's got to protect his new communist ally, Fidel Castro, especially after that disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion that the U.S. backed a year earlier. But on the other hand, he wants to poke the bear. He wants to give the Americans, and this is his phrase, a little of their own medicine. And this is where it gets really interesting, because it shows you the kind of terrifying chess game that was the Cold War. You see, the U.S. had already put its own nuclear missiles, Jupiter missiles, in Turkey, and Turkey is right on the Soviet Union's doorstep. So from Khrushchev's point of view, putting his missiles in Cuba, that wasn't some crazy escalation. It was just leveling the playing field. And the sheer scale of this secret operation is just staggering. We're talking about 85 Soviet ships making 185 trips across the Atlantic. They secretly moved 42,000 troops and more than 160 nuclear warheads to Cuba. The secrecy was so intense that the locals, seeing all these long covered trucks moving around in the middle of the night, they started joking that the Soviets must be importing palm trees. Little did they know. As you can imagine, a secret that big, well, it's not going to stay secret for long. And sure enough, on October 14th, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane is flying way, way up high over Cuba, and it snaps a few photos. Photos that were about to change everything. So the photos get back to the CIA, analysts start looking at them, and their blood just runs cold. The number they came up with? 80 million. That's how many Americans could be killed if those missiles went operational and were launched. 80 million casualties in a matter of minutes. Can you imagine being in the White House right then? President Kennedy's advisors are completely split. You've got the hawks on one side, basically screaming for an immediate military strike. Guys like Dean Acheson, who basically said, just attack, don't even talk about it. And then you have the doves pleading for caution, absolutely terrified that one wrong move could trigger a full-blown, world-ending nuclear war. In the end, Kennedy decides to walk a tightrope. He says no to an immediate attack, but he knows he has to do something. So on October 22nd, he goes on national television and tells the entire world what's happening. His move? A naval quarantine around Cuba. Now, he called it a quarantine, not a blockade, because a blockade is technically an act of war. It was a very deliberate choice of words to stop more Soviet ships without starting World War III. And so it began. Section 3. 13 days on the brink. The clock is now officially ticking. For 13 days, the world's two superpowers are locked in a standoff, eyeball to eyeball, and nobody knows who's going to blink first. And just look at how incredibly fast this all unfolded. I mean, from Kennedy finding out about the missiles, to him telling the world, to Soviet ships literally sailing toward the American quarantine line, the tension was just ratcheting up, not day by day, but hour by hour. And it all leads to this one day, which was probably the most dangerous day in modern history. October 27th. They called it Black Saturday. And honestly, if there was ever a day the world was going to end, this was probably it. On this single day, a whole series of events happened all at once that pushed everyone right to the edge. So get this, just a cascade of chaos. First, an American U-2 spy plane is shot down over Cuba, and the pilot is killed. At the same time, Kennedy gets two totally different messages from Khrushchev. One sounds reasonable, the other is much more demanding. And then, to top it all off, a frantic Fidel Castro, convinced a U.S. invasion is about to happen, is basically begging Khrushchev to launch a preemptive nuclear strike against America. The situation was completely spinning out of control. You can just feel the clock ticking, can't you? The president's own brother, Robert Kennedy, captured the feeling in the White House. He felt they only had hours left, maybe a day, to make a decision. The window for finding a peaceful way out of this was slamming shut. An invasion of Cuba was actively being planned, and everybody in that room knew exactly what that would mean. So here we are, Section 4, a deal to save the world. With everything about to fall apart, the last desperate hope was a secret negotiation, a back-channel meeting between Robert Kennedy and the Soviet ambassador. And somehow, they pulled it off. They hammered out a deal. Here's how it worked. Publicly, the Soviets agreed to take all their missiles out of Cuba. In return, the U.S. promised publicly that they would never invade Cuba. But there was a secret part. A secret promise that the U.S. would also, quietly, remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey down the line. So on October 28th, Khrushchev gets on the radio, announces the deal, and the entire planet lets out a collective sigh of relief. But hold on. While Washington and Moscow were celebrating, the mood in Havana was, well, it was furious. Fidel Castro didn't even hear about the deal from his Soviet allies. He found out from a news report. He felt totally betrayed, like he was just a pawn in their game. He was reportedly so angry, he smashed a mirror in his office. Okay, so our final section. Who really won? The missiles are gone, the immediate danger has passed. But the second the crisis was over, the debate began. What did it all mean? Did anybody really win? And was this a triumph of diplomacy? Or did we all just get incredibly lucky? Well, on one side, you have the people who saw Kennedy as a hero. He stood up to the Soviets, didn't back down, and made Khrushchev blank. A huge win for America. But then you have the other side. People like the journalist I.F. Stone, who looked at this and said, hold on a second. This was an insane gamble, a high-stakes bluff that could have destroyed the entire world. They saw it not as strength, but as pure recklessness. So what's the takeaway here? Well, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a massive wake-up call. It forced both superpowers to stare into the abyss and realize how close they came to mutual destruction. It actually led to them setting up the famous hotline so Washington and Moscow could talk directly. But it leaves us with this huge, chilling question that still hangs in the air today. Was this a masterclass in crisis management, or did humanity just get really, really lucky? And more importantly, could a bluff like that ever work again?